I always thought that staying silent would keep things under control, that if I didn't speak up, nothing would go wrong. Life, however, taught me that sometimes silence becomes the heaviest burden you carry, one that crushes you from the inside. Looking back, I can see now how every small moment I ignored, every time I swallowed my words, eventually added up into a storm I couldn't escape. It all began when I joined college. A new batch, new faces, and an atmosphere filled with excitement and anticipation. Everyone seemed so confident, so comfortable in their own circles. I was reserved by nature, preferring to listen rather than speak, to observe rather than participate. But there was one girl, AITA, who noticed me right away. There was something about the way she smiled, the casual confidence in her voice, and the subtle teasing that drew people toward her. We started talking casually, discussing assignments, sharing lunch breaks, and sometimes working together on small projects. Everything seemed innocent, normal, yet I quickly noticed that she had a group of friends who, in my presence, often made jokes or shared conversations I didn't fully understand. Instead of speaking up, I stayed quiet, convincing myself that I was overreacting. Then came a moment that stuck with me. We were doing a group study session at the library. AITA shared a joke with her friends. Everyone laughed. I didn't understand it, so I stayed quiet in the corner. She noticed and teased me lightly, and I just smiled, too embarrassed to explain myself. But that small incident became another brick in the wall I was building around myself. Every time I felt uncomfortable, I stayed silent. Every time I wanted to speak, I convinced myself to stay quiet. Weeks later, another incident happened. Our college was organizing a cultural fest and responsibilities were assigned. I was put in charge of something important, stage decoration and seating arrangements. I worked meticulously, submitted a detailed plan, but some seniors criticized it openly. I felt humiliated but didn't defend myself. I wrote notes in my notebook, observing quietly, pretending to be fine. My silence was misinterpreted as incompetence, and I started noticing that people were forming judgments about me without knowing the full story. The pattern continued. Any mistake, any misunderstanding, I let it slide, burying my thoughts and feelings. AITA noticed sometimes she didn't. I kept telling myself I was avoiding drama, that I was being mature. But inside, the weight was growing heavier, the walls closing in. My silence, my hesitation, was no longer protection. It had become my cage. I had always believed cooking was one of those skills you magically unlocked when you really needed it, like confidence or emotional maturity. Until that day, my relationship with the kitchen was simple and peaceful because it didn't exist. My meals came in boxes, wrappers, or bags, handed over by tired delivery drivers who knew my address better than my relatives. Still, when my crush casually mentioned she loved home-cooked food, my brain immediately made a dangerous decision on my behalf. I would cook for her. Her name was Sarah, and she had that effortless kind of charm that made ordinary conversations feel important. We worked in the same building, but different departments, which meant just enough distance to stay mysterious and just enough proximity to overthink every interaction. One evening, while we were talking about weekend plans, she joked about how people these days couldn't survive without food apps. I laughed a little too hard and said something that changed my destiny. I told her I actually enjoyed cooking. The lie left my mouth smoothly, confidently, without hesitation. She smiled and said she'd love to try something I made someday. That was the moment panic quietly moved in and unpacked its bags. I nodded, smiled back, and agreed, all while my inner voice screamed that I had never cooked anything beyond instant noodles without supervision. But backing out wasn't an option anymore. Pride, hope, and stupidity had joined forces. I invited her over for dinner that weekend, assuring her it would be simple and homemade. She agreed, and just like that, I had 48 hours to transform into a person I wasn't. The planning stage gave me false confidence. I watched cooking videos at double speed, convincing myself that chopping onions was mostly about attitude. I Googled easy, impressive dinner recipes and ignored anything that used words like simmer, marinade, or preheat for 30 minutes. I settled on pasta because it felt safe, international, and romantic. Pasta was basically boiled confidence with sauce, right? I made a shopping list that included items I had never purchased before, but spelled confidently anyway. The grocery store was my first reality check. I stood in front of shelves full of sauces, completely frozen, realizing I didn't know the difference between marinara and arabaya. I picked one based on packaging aesthetics and hoped for the best.
I bought garlic because every video aggressively emphasized garlic, even though I wasn't sure how much was too much. The cashier scanned my items while I imagined myself explaining the dish to Sarah like I knew what I was doing. Back home, I cleaned my apartment like my life depended on it. The kitchen, however, betrayed me immediately. I owned exactly one pan that had seen better days, and a pot that whistled ominously when heated. Still, I laid everything out neatly, put on music, and tried to channel calm energy. Cooking, I told myself, was just following instructions. Then I turned on the stove. Things started going wrong quietly at first. The garlic burned faster than expected, filling the apartment with a smell that was less romantic and more concerning. I added oil to compensate, which only created smoke. I opened a window and told myself this was normal, that chefs probably dealt with this all the time. The pasta water boiled over because I forgot salt, but remembered it too late. I cleaned the mess with one hand while stirring sauce with the other, feeling like I was fighting an invisible enemy. By the time Sarah texted that she was on her way, my confidence was hanging by a thread. The sauce tasted strange, not terrible, but not impressive either. I added spices randomly, trusting my instincts, which was my second mistake. The kitchen looked like a crime scene, and I was sweating through my shirt. I told myself it would come together at the last moment, because movies had taught me that chaos always resolves into beauty. Sarah arrived exactly on time, smiling, carrying a small dessert. I greeted her with forced calm, hoping she wouldn't notice the faint smell of smoke still lingering. She complimented the apartment, and I rushed her to the living room, insisting she relax while I finished cooking. In reality, I needed to hide the disaster unfolding in the kitchen. As she sat on the couch, I returned to the stove and tasted the sauce again. It was worse. Somewhere between panic and denial, I realized I had no idea how to fix it. The pasta was overcooked, the sauce was confused, and my confidence had officially evaporated. My phone buzzed with a food delivery notification from earlier browsing, mocking me silently. I stood there, staring at the pot, understanding that my dream of impressing her with culinary skills was collapsing in real time. The question was no longer whether the food was good, but whether I could recover without revealing the lie that started it all. And that's when I did the unthinkable. I opened a delivery app and ordered pizza.
The moment I placed the pizza order, a strange calm washed over me. The kind that comes right after making a terrible but necessary decision. The app fully confirmed my order and gave me an estimated delivery time of 25 minutes, which suddenly felt like an eternity and a miracle at the same time. I stared at the screen, then at the ruined pasta, and accepted that there was no going back. The kitchen was no longer a place of ambition. It was now a crime scene that needed to be hidden. I quickly turned off the stove and moved the pot out of sight like it might confess if Sarah saw it. I sprayed air freshener aggressively, creating a confusing mix of burnt garlic and artificial lavender. Then I washed my hands, fixed my hair, and practiced a calm face in the mirror, the kind that said everything was going according to plan. When I returned to the living room, Sarah was scrolling on her phone, relaxed and smiling, completely unaware that my culinary dreams had already died. We started talking, and for a few minutes things felt normal again. She told me about her week, her coworkers, small stories that made her laugh softly. I nodded, responded, and laughed at the right moments, but my mind was counting seconds. Every sound from outside made my heart jump, convinced it was the delivery rider arriving too early or too late. I realized that lying about cooking had now evolved into managing the lie without making it worse. Eventually, she asked the question I had been dreading. She leaned back on the couch and casually asked what I was making. My brain froze, then quickly assembled a vague answer. I said pasta, something simple but comforting, hoping the lack of detail wouldn't raise suspicion. She smiled and said she loved pasta, which felt like the universe personally mocking me. I nodded confidently while internally apologizing to every Italian ancestor. The doorbell finally rang, louder than it needed to be. Panic shot through me, but relief followed immediately. I stood up a little too fast and said I'd get it. When I opened the door and saw the pizza box, I felt both defeated and grateful. The delivery guy handed it over without judgment, unaware that he had just saved my evening. I thanked him and closed the door, holding the box like it was evidence. Walking back into the living room was the hardest part. Sarah looked at the box, then at me, clearly surprised. I hesitated for a split second, then decided that partial honesty was safer than a complete lie. I laughed awkwardly and admitted that my cooking attempt had gone wrong and that I didn't want to risk serving her something terrible. For a moment, I waited for disappointment. Instead, she laughed, not politely, but genuinely. She said she appreciated the honesty and joked that ordering pizza was a solid backup plan. The tension I'd been carrying melted instantly. We sat on the floor, opened the box, and ate slices straight from it, talking freely now that the pressure was gone. As we ate, she told me she cared more about effort than perfection, and that trying mattered more than success. Her words hit harder than any compliment could have.
I realized that my biggest mistake hadn't been burning garlic or overcooking pasta. It had been pretending to be someone I wasn't. The night shifted from a performance into something real, something comfortable. By the time we finished eating, the pizza boxes empty and laughter filling the room, I knew this evening wasn't a failure anymore. It had simply taken an unexpected turn. And somewhere between greasy fingers and honest conversation, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this disaster had worked in my favor. After dinner, the atmosphere felt lighter than I ever expected it to. The pressure I had built in my head completely disappeared, replaced by something calm and real. We moved from the floor to the couch, still laughing about my failed attempt at being a chef. She teased me about how confident I had sounded when I invited her, and I admitted that confidence was mostly fear wearing a nice outfit. Instead of judging me, she found it funny, even relatable, and that made me relax even more. At some point, she asked to see the kitchen, and there was no point in saying no. I showed her the disaster honestly. The burnt pan, the abandoned pot of pasta, the spices thrown together without logic. She shook her head, smiling, and said it looked like effort, not incompetence. That sentence stayed with me because no one had ever framed failure that way before. We spent the rest of the evening talking about random things, childhood memories, embarrassing moments, and small dreams. Without trying to impress her, I felt more confident than I had all night. I realized that pretending to be perfect had almost ruined something that honesty had saved. When she finally got up to leave, she thanked me for dinner, pizza included, and said she'd like to come over again. Maybe next time we could cook together. After she left, I sat alone on the couch, surrounded by empty pizza boxes and a messy kitchen, but smiling like an idiot. The night hadn't gone according to plan, but it had gone better than expected. I learned that trying too hard to impress someone often does the opposite, while being honest creates space for real connection. I never did become a great cook overnight, but I did learn something more important. You don't win someone over with perfection. You win them over by being real. And sometimes the pizza you ordered to cover a mistake ends up being the best part of the night.